It wouldn't work out because his fur radiates from his nose and longs to.
Isabella. Mrs. Frisby spelled it out slowly. The plan of the Rats of NIMH? What or where was NIMH? The name had a strange and faraway sound. Had these rats then come here from someplace else? Did that explain why they had books and lights and wires and electric motor? Yet they had been here, or at least there had been rats here, for as long as she could remember. Still, that was not so very long. She wondered what other things they had. Suddenly, she had an almost overwhelming desire to look around, to see what was behind the other doors and down the other corridors. She went to the door, opened it, and looked out into the hall. It was entirely deserted and silent, except that when she listened carefully, she could hear a faint humming in the distance, as if something were running. Another motor? She started out into the hall and then changed her mind. Better not. Nicodemus had been friendly. They had all been friendly, but explicit. He had said she was to wait in the library, and she was not there to pry, but to get help. She went back into the library, closed the door, and sat on one of the benches. The books on the table were mostly paperbacks, small enough so that the rats could handle them easily enough, but too big for her. So she sat in front of the blackboard and looked at it again. Beneath the title, across the top, in neatly chalked handwriting, were columns of words and figures. Schedule. January. Group 1, 10. Oats, 30 loads equals 2 BU. Group 2, 10. Wheat, 30 loads equals 2 BU. Group 3, 10. Corn, 20 loads equals 1½ BU. Group 4, 10. Miscellaneous seeds, estimated 10 loads total. The rest of the blackboard was filled with more rows of figures, each headed by the name of a month: February, March, April, May, and so on through July. At the bottom, a separate square was ruled off. Plows, Arthur's group, 14. Plow number 2, complete, Jan 1. Plow number 3, complete, Feb 10. Plow number 4, complete, Mar 20. Mrs. Frisby stared at all this, trying to make head or tail of it, but she could not. It was quite incomprehensible. She was still puzzling over it when the door opened and a rat came in. It was a girl rat, small and quite young, judging by her looks. She was carrying a pencil and some papers and looking at the papers as she walked, so that she did not see Mrs. Frisby at first. When she did, she gasped and dropped the papers, scattering them on the floor, her eyes wide open. "Who are you?" she asked. "I don't know you. How did you get in?" She backed toward the door. "It's all right," said Mrs. Frisby. "I'm a friend of Mr. Age's." The rat was very young indeed, only a child. "But why are you in here? Who let you in?" "Nicodemus. He told me to wait here." The girl rat looked doubtful. "You might be a spy." A spy? How could I be? A spy from where?" "I don't know. From outside? Maybe from NIMH. I don't even know what NIMH is." "That's what you say." "But I don't. What is it?" asked Mrs. Frisby, feeling slightly annoyed. "It's a place." The girl rat, her alarm apparently subsiding, began picking up her scattered papers. "I'm supposed to be practicing my reading." "What kind of place?" "It's where we come from." "I don't know too much about it. I've never been there. How can you come from there if you've never been there? My father and mother did. I was born afterward. I think it's white. Anyway, I know one thing. We don't want to go back. We don't want to get caught. So, Mrs. Frisby thought, that sounds as if whatever NIMH was, the rats had escaped from it to come here. But she realized that she was not likely to get very clear information from such a child. Again, she hoped that Nicodemus would explain it. Did Nicodemus come from NIMH too? Yes. And Justin? Yes. You know Justin? Yes. I guess you're not a spy, said the girl rat. She sounded mildly disappointed. Then she added irrelevantly, Justin's not married. She climbed on one of the benches and opened a book. He's the best one of all. He's not even afraid of dragon. She read in the book for perhaps 30 seconds, picked up her pencil, then put it down again. I'm too young to get married. I suppose so, said Mrs. Frisby. For a while yet, but that won't last long. That's what my mother says, but it seems long, and Justin might marry somebody else. Maybe not, said Mrs. Frisby, who could see beyond the tip of her nose. He's pretty young himself yet. What's your name? Isabella. It's a pretty name. It's all right. Only my brother calls me Izzy. I don't like that. I don't wonder. Where's your brother? At the meeting. He's older. All the men are at the meeting, but my mother didn't go. The mothers don't always go. She's in the grain room, packing grain. Packing grain for the plan. She doesn't like the plan, though. The plan again. What is the plan? Why doesn't she like it? It's just the plan for where we're going to live and all that. She doesn't like it because she says it's too hard. No more electric lights, no more refrigerator, no more running water. But she isn't deserting or anything, not like Jenner. We didn't like Jenner. Who's Jenner? He was in the group, but he quit. Maybe he went back to NIMH. We don't know. Mrs. Frisby was gradually getting a picture of life in the rat colony, a somewhat confusing one because Isabella was a child, but nonetheless certain things were apparent. They had a grain room, presumably for food storage. The females sometimes went to meetings and sometimes not. Nicodemus seemed to be the leader. They had a plan for the future that some rats did not like, and one named Jenner had deserted, or had others gone with him. She was about to ask Isabella when the library door opened and Nicodemus, Justin, and Mr. Ages entered. Another rat came with them, a stranger. A powder for dragon. The strange rat was named Arthur. He was stocky, square, and muscular, with bright, hard eyes. He looked efficient. You might call him our chief engineer, said Nicodemus to Mrs. Frisby. As indeed, you might call Justin the captain of the guard, if we had any such titles, but we don't. Mr. Aegis thought Arthur should come along, though he didn't say why. So we still don't know what your problem is. Isabella was gone. She had dropped her papers on the floor again when the others had entered, and Justin, to her intense confusion and visible delight, had helped her pick them up. Hello, Izzy, he had said. How's the reading coming? It's fine, she said. I finished the third reader last week. Now I'm on the fourth. The fourth already? You're getting quite grown up. At that, she had almost dropped the papers a third time and made a dash for the door. It did not matter, Mrs. Frisby noticed, if Justin called her Izzy. just so he called her something. Nicodemus closed the door behind her, then sat down on one of the benches facing Mrs. Frisby. The others sat down too, Mr. Ages stretching his splintered leg in front of him. Nicodemus took the reading glass from his satchel, opened it, and through it gravely examined Mrs. Frisby's face. "You will forgive the glass and the scrutiny," he said. "When I lost my left eye, I also damaged the right one. I can see little close up without the glass. Indeed, not very much even with it." At length, he folded the glass and put it on the table. "Now," he said, "what is it we can do to help you?" So, Mrs. Frisby recounted once more the events that had led to her coming here, and at the end repeated what the owl had advised her to say. "Move the house into the lee of the stone," she added. "I don't understand just what he meant by that. Jeremy, the crow, says it means the side where there's no wind, but what good would that do?" "I think I know what he meant," said Nicodemus. "In a broad sense, lee means the sheltered side. A bird flying over Mrs. Fitzgibbon's garden would notice something most of us would miss." He reached into his satchel and took out a sheet of paper and pencil. He opened the reading glass again. As he talked, he drew a sketch. "When a farmer plows a field with a big rock in it, he plows around the rock, close on each side, but leaving a triangle of unplowed land on each end. Mrs. Frisby's house is beside the rock and will get plowed up and probably crushed, as the owl said. But if we can move it a few feet so that it lies buried behind the rock in the lee, then she and her children can stay in it as long as they need to. From the air, the way the owl sees it, the garden would look like this." He inspected the sketch through the reading glass and then placed it on the table. Mrs. Frisby climbed up on the bench and looked at it. It was a rough map showing the garden, the big stone near the middle, and the way the furrows made by the plow would curve around it, rather like waves around a boat. "Show me where your house is buried," said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby pointed to the spot on the sketch. "I know where that cinder block is," said the rat named Arthur. "In fact, I thought about bringing it in, but I decided it was too long a haul. They had it tied on top of the harrow for weight, and it fell off just as they were finishing the garden." "Can you move it?" asked Nicodemus, pointing at the sketch. "To this spot right here, and bury it again?" "Yes," said Arthur. "That shouldn't be hard." Mrs. Frisby was delighted. Looking at the map, it all became clear. She could see what a beautifully simple idea it was. When Mr. Fitzgibbon plowed, he would go right past their house. They would not have to move until Timothy was well and until the weather was truly warm. She remembered again what her husband had said, how easy to unlock a door when you have the key. She had found the key, or rather, the owl had found it. Nicodemus asked Arthur, "How long will it take?" "Depends. With a party of 10, a couple of hours. With 20, maybe an hour." "We can spare 20, but it's still too long." He looked worried. So did Arthur. "Yes," he said. "We'll have to work at night, but even so, there's just no cover at all. It's wide open." "We'll have to take care of Dragon," said Justin. Yes, said Mr. Ages, and with this leg I can't do it. I'd never make it to the bowl, much less get back again. Mrs. Frisby, looking at their baffled faces, felt her delight subsiding. Obviously something was wrong. I don't understand, she said. I know about Dragon, of course, but at night, said Justin, Dragon prowls the farmyard like a tiger, and you don't see him until he's on top of you. Then you can't move my house after all. Well, Justin said, ordinarily. He turned to Nicodemus. Should I explain it to her? Yes, said Nicodemus. Ordinarily, said Justin. When we have a long project to do at night, sometimes even by day, we make sure Dragon won't bother us. We put sleeping powder in his food. Mr. Ages makes it. It doesn't do the cat any harm, but he stays extremely drowsy for the next 8 hours or so. We station a sentry to watch him, and we're free to work. You did it yesterday, cried Mrs. Frisby, remembering the figures toiling the wire through the grass, remembering how strangely disinterested Dragon had seemed when he saw her. I saw the cat sleeping in the yard. Yes, said Justin, but today Mr. Ages has a broken leg. Then he can't make the powder. It isn't that, said Mr. Ages. I've plenty of powder. The trouble is, said Justin, it's Mr. Ages who puts it in Dragon's dinner bowl inside the farm kitchen. With his leg broken, he can't move fast enough. But why Mr. Ages? Said Mrs. Frisby. Can't someone else do it? I'd be glad to do it myself, said Justin, but I'm too big. You see, Nicodemus explained, Mrs. Fitzgibbon feeds the cat in the morning and in the evening, and his bowl is always kept in the same place, next to a cabinet in one corner of the kitchen. There's a very shallow space between the floor and the bottom of the cabinet. A few years ago, when we conceived the idea of putting Dragon to sleep, we cut a hole in the floor just behind the cabinet. If we put it anywhere else, they'd see it. To reach the bowl, Mr. Ages crawls under the cabinet. When he gets to the edge, he makes a quick dash to the bowl, drops in the powder, and dashes back out of sight. But with a broken leg, he can't dash. We might try leaving some bait outside the house, said Justin. That worked once. Once out of a dozen tries, said Nicodemus. It isn't dependable, and we don't have much time. To be safe, we ought to move that block tonight. If we had some cat food, said Justin, thinking aloud, he might eat that, even on the porch, because he knows it's his. Maybe tonight I could go in through the attic and down to the kitchen. No use, said Mr. Ages. They keep it in a metal cabinet up on the wall. You couldn't get it without a crew, and that would make too much noise. Anyway, said Nicodemus, it would put off moving the block until tomorrow night. Then Justin said, I guess what we do is stake out scouts wherever we can. Try to keep track of Dragon and hope for the best. Some nights he doesn't go near the garden at all. We might be lucky. Or we might not, said Arthur. I don't like it. We can't dig that block out without some noise, you know. Mrs. Frisby interrupted quietly. There is another way, she said. If Mr. Ages can get into the kitchen, so can I. If you will give me the powder and show me the way, I will try to put it in Dragon's bowl. Justin said quickly, No, it's no job for a lady. You forget, Mrs. Frisby said. I'm Timothy's mother. If you and Arthur and the others in your group can take risks to save him, surely I can too. And consider this, I don't want any of you to be hurt, maybe even killed, by dragon. But even more, I don't want the attempt to fail. Perhaps the worst that will happen to you, with luck, is that you will have to scatter and run, and leave my house unmoved. But then what will happen to us? Timothy, at least, will die. So, if there is no one else to put the cat to sleep, I must do it. Nicodemus considered and then spoke.
She's right, of course. If she chooses to take the risk, we can't deny her the right.
To Mrs. Frisby, he added,
But you should know that the danger is great. It was in the same kitchen yesterday, running from Dragon's Bull, that Mr. Ages got his leg broken, and it was in doing the same thing last year that your husband died.
the marketplace. Mrs. Frisby's head was buried in her arms. I never knew, she said. All I knew was that he didn't come back, but I never knew what happened. I didn't even know he knew you. Why didn't he ever tell me? Justin touched her shoulder gently.
It's hard for you to learn it this way, so suddenly, he said. We thought about telling you when it happened, but we decided we shouldn't. It wouldn't have done any good. You ask why Jonathan never told you about us?
Nicodemus added.
He had a good reason, a good one. Still, he worried about it a lot, and he might have told you in the end, but then it was too late.
What was the reason? Mrs. Frisby raised her face. There were tears on her cheeks, but she had stopped crying.
To answer that, I would have to tell you quite a long story. The whole story about us, and Nim, and Jonathan, and how we came here. He came with us, you see. I don't mind doing that, but I don't know if there is time now.
I think there is, said Justin.
If Mr. Ages and I go to get the powder while you're telling it.
With this leg, said Mr. Ages glumly, that will take long enough to tell it twice.
I had forgotten, said Justin contritely. Would it be better if I went alone?
No, said Mr. Ages. There are so many different powders in my storeroom, you wouldn't know which one to bring back. I'll go with you, but we'll go slowly.
And I, said Arthur, will see about the equipment for tonight. We'll need shovels, crowbars, block and tackle, rollers.
He left, still listing tools. Nicodemus said to Mrs. Frisby,
I think that we too should leave the library. There will be others coming in, like Isabella, to practice reading, and some to do research.
Research?
We've got some new books on agriculture, farming, gardening, fertilizing, things like that. And we're studying them. It's part of the plan.
I don't know what the plan is.
No, agreed Nicodemus. But when I've told you our story, you'll understand that too.
He opened the door and led Mrs. Frisby down the corridor past several more doors, all closed. He stopped before one, which he opened.
My office, he said. Please come in.
The room she entered was smaller than the library, but much more comfortably, almost elegantly furnished. There was a rug on the floor, the same pattern she noticed as the carpet in the hallway above, a light recessed in the ceiling, and another on the wall next to the table. There were bookshelves. On one shelf, an electric clock hummed quietly to itself. A book lay open on the table, with a chair in front of it. Against the opposite wall stood a small sofa, neatly upholstered in cloth. But what attracted Mrs. Frisby's attention most was a box in one corner of the room, a box with dials and a small light shining on the front. From this box came the soft sound of music. She listened, entranced.
You like music?
Said Nicodemus.
So do I.
That must be a radio. Again, something vaguely remembered from what Jonathan had once told her. Music. She had heard it only 2 or 3 times in her life, when the Fitzgibbons had left a window open and someone was playing inside, and never up close. It was a lovely sound.
Yes,
Said Nicodemus.
we didn't get it for music, of course, but to hear the news. Still, as long as it's here, why not use it?
He sat down, and so did Mrs. Frisby.
Now,
He said,
I will tell you about NIMH. You'll be interested, I think, because your husband was part of it. And when I'm finished, I think you will see why he felt he could not tell you himself.
The story begins, Nicodemus continued, not at NIMH, but at a marketplace on the edge of a big city. It was called the Farmers' Market, a great square of a place with a roof over part of it and no walls to speak of. There, early every morning, the farmers arrived from all over the surrounding countryside with trucks full of tomatoes, corn, cabbages, potatoes, eggs, chickens, hams, food for the city. One part of it was reserved for the fishermen, who brought crabs and oysters and bass and flounders. It was a fine place, noisy and full of smells. We lived near this market, my father, my mother, my 9 sisters and brothers and I, underground in a big pipe that had once been part of a storm sewer, but was no longer used. There were hundreds of other rats in the neighborhood. It was a rough life, but not so hard as you might think, because of the market. Every evening at 5 o'clock, the farmers and the fishermen would close up their stalls, pack their trucks, and go home. At night, hours later, the cleanup men would arrive with brooms and hoses. But in between the market was ours, the food the farmers left behind. Peas and beans that fell from the trucks, tomatoes and squashes, pieces of meat and fish trimmed as waste. They lay on the sidewalks and in the gutters. They filled great cans that were supposed to be covered, but seldom were. There was always 10 times more than what we could eat, and so there was never any need for fighting over it. Fighting? Quite the contrary. The marketplace was a perfect place for playing, and so we did, the young rats at least, as soon as we had finished eating. There were empty boxes for hide and seek. There were walls to climb, tin cans to roll, and pieces of twine to tie and swing on. There was even, in the middle of the square, a fountain to swim in when the weather was hot. Then, at the first clang of the cleanup men in the distance, one of the older rats would sound a warning, and everyone would pick up as much food as they could to carry home. All of us kept a reserved supply because some days, Sundays and holidays, the market would be closed, and we were never quite sure when this would happen. When I went to the market, it was usually with 2 companions, my older brother Gerald and a friend of ours named Jenner. These were my 2 closest friends. We liked the same games, the same jokes, the same topics of conversation, even the same kinds of food. I practically admired Jenner, who was extremely quick and intelligent. One evening in early fall, Jenner and I set out for the marketplace. It must have been September, for the leaves were just turning yellow and some children were throwing a football in a vacant lot. Gerald had to stay home that night. He had caught a cold, and since the air was chilly, my mother thought he should not go out. So Jenner and I went without him. I remember we promised to bring him back some of his favorite food, beef liver, if we could find any. We took our usual route to the marketplace, not along the streets, but through the narrow walkways between the buildings, mostly commercial warehouses and garages that bordered the square. As we walked, we were joined by more rats. At that time of day, they converged on the marketplace from all directions. When we reached the square, I noticed that there was a white truck of an odd square shape parked on the street bordering it, perhaps a block away. I say I noticed it. I did not pay any particular attention to it, for trucks were common enough in that part of town. But if I had, I would have noticed that printed on each side of it were 4 small letters, NIMH. I would not have known what they were, of course, for at that time neither I nor any of the other rats knew how to read. It was growing dark when we reached the market, but through the dusk we could see that there was an unusually large supply of food, a great mound of it, near the center of the square, away from the roofed-over portion. I suppose that should have served as a warning, but it didn't. I remember Jenner's saying, "They must have had a really busy day," and we ran joyfully toward the pile along with several dozen other rats. Just as we reached the food, it happened. All around us suddenly there was shouting. Bright, blinding, searchlights flashed on, aimed at us and at the mound of food, so that when we tried to run away from it, we could not see where we were going. Between and behind the lights there were shadows moving swiftly, and as they came toward us, I could see that they were men in white uniforms carrying nets, round nets with long handles. "Look out!" cried Jenner. "They're trying to catch us." He darted in one direction, I in another, and I lost sight of him. We all ran, straight toward the men with the nets. There was no other way to run. They had us encircled. The nets flailed down, scooped, flailed again. I suppose some rats made it through, slipping between the men and past the lights. I felt a swish. A net just missed me. I turned and ran back toward the mound, thinking I might hide myself in it. But then came another swish, and that time I felt the enveloping fibers fall over me. They entangled my legs, then my neck. I was lifted from the ground, along with 3 other rats, and the net closed around us. In the cage, Mrs. Frisby said, "But why did they want to catch you? And how did you ever get away again?"
"At first," said Nicodemus, "I thought it must be because they didn't like our stealing the food. And yet you could hardly even call it stealing. It was waste food. And all they did with it was haul it away to the city incinerator. So what harm if we ate some of it? Of course, there are people who just dislike rats, whether they're doing any harm or not."
"And mice, too," said Mrs. Frisby.
"True," said Nicodemus, "though not so much as rats, I think. Anyway, that wasn't the reason at all. But what the real reason was, I didn't find out for a while. As to getting away, that too didn't happen until much later."
"No, I was firmly and inextricably caught, snared in the net and helpless," Nicodemus continued. "When the man who held it saw that he had 4 rats, he pulled a drawstring that closed it up. He put the net down and picked up another, an empty one. He moved on into the square, leaving us to lie there. I tried gnawing my way out, but the strands were made of some kind of plastic as hard as wire. The noise and movement began to die down eventually. I supposed the rats in the square had all either been caught or had escaped. I heard one man call to another,
"I guess that's the lot."
Someone else was turning a light this way and that, searching the rest of the market area.
"Not a one to be seen. We could hide and wait for another wave. There won't be another wave. Not tonight. Probably not for 4 or 5 nights. Word gets around. You mean they communicate?
A third voice.
You bet they communicate. And the next time they do come, you can be sure they'll case the place carefully. We were lucky. These rats hadn't been bothered for years. They'd grown careless. How many did the lab order?
Someone was turning out the lights one at a time.
5 dozen. How many have we got? About that. Maybe more. Let's load the truck.
In a minute or so, I felt myself being lifted up and swinging back and forth in the nets. I was carried with my 3 companions to the white truck I had seen earlier. Its back doors were open, and it was lighted inside. I could see that its whole interior was a large wire cage. Into this our net was thrust. The man then opened the drawstring, and we were dumped onto the floor, which was covered with sawdust. The other nets were emptied one at a time the same way, and in a few minutes there was a good-sized crowd of us on the floor, all more or less dazed, and all, if I was typical, terrified. The cage was locked, the doors clanged shut, and the lights went out. I heard the truck motor start. A second later, the floor lurched beneath me. We were moving. Where were they taking us? For what purpose? Then, in the dark, I heard a voice beside me.
Nicodemus.
It was Jenner. You can imagine how glad I was to hear him. But I was sorry, too.
Jenner, I thought maybe you got away. I was in the last net. I thought I saw you cross the floor. Where are we going?
I don't know.
What's a lab?
A laboratory?
Yes, but what is it?
I don't know. I've just heard the word somewhere.
Well, I think that's where we're going, whatever it is.
The truck rumbled along through the dark, over bumpy streets at first, then at a higher speed, over a smooth highway. There were no windows in the back, so it was impossible to see where we were going. Not that I would have known anyway, never before having been more than half a dozen blocks from home. I think we drove for about 2 hours, but it might have been less, before the truck slowed and turned and finally came to a stop. The back doors were opened again, and through the wire wall of the cage, I saw that we had come to a building, very modern, of white cement and glass. It was square and big, about 10 stories tall. Night had fallen, and most of its windows were dark, but the platform to which our truck drove us was lighted, and there were people waiting for us. A door opened, and 3 men came out. One of them pushed a cart, a hand truck piled with small wire cages. The man beside him was dressed in a heavy coat, boots, and thick leather gloves. The third man wore heavy horn-rimmed glasses and a white coat. He was obviously the leader. The men from the truck, the ones who had caught us, now joined the men from the building.
How many did you get?
Asked the man in the white coat.
Hard to count. They keep moving around, but I make it between 60 and 70.
Good. Any trouble?
Nah, it was easy. They acted almost tame.
I hope not. I've got enough tame ones.
Oh, they're lively enough, and they look healthy.
Let's get them out. The man with the gloves and the boots then donned a wire face mask as well and climbed in among us. He opened a small sliding trap door at the back of our cage. A man outside held one of the small cages up to the opening, and one at a time we were pushed out into our individual little prisons. A few of the rats snarled and tried to bite. I did not, and neither did Jenner. It was too obviously futile. When it was finished, the man in the white coat said, 63. Good work. A man from the truck said, "Thanks, Dr. Schultz." And we were racked on the hand truck and wheeled into the building. Dr. Schultz, I did not know it then, but I was to be his prisoner and his pupil for the next 3 years. We spent the rest of that night in a long white room. It was, in fact, a laboratory, and with a lot of equipment at one end that I didn't understand at all then. Bottles and shiny metal things and black boxes with wires trailing from them. But our end held only rows of cages on shelves, each cage with a tag on it, and each separated from its neighbors by wooden partitions on both sides. Someone came around with a stack of small jars and fastened one to my cage. A little pipe led through the bars like a sipping straw, drinking water. Then the lights were dimmed, and we were left alone. That cage was my home for a long time. It was not uncomfortable. It had a floor of some kind of plastic, medium soft and warm to the touch, with wire walls and ceiling. It was airy enough, yet just the fact that it was a cage made it horrible. I, who had always run where I wanted, could go 3 hops forward, 3 hops back again, and that was all. But worse was the dreadful feeling. I know we all had it, that we were completely at the mercy of someone we knew not at all, for some purpose we could not guess. What were their plans for us? As it turned out, the uncertainty itself was the worst suffering we had to undergo. We were treated well enough, except for some very small, very quick flashes of pain, which were part of our training. And we were always well fed, though the food, scientifically compiled pellets, was not what you'd call delicious. But of course we didn't know that when we arrived, and I doubt that any of us got much sleep that first night. I know I didn't. So in a way it was a relief when early the next morning the lights snapped on and Dr. Schultz entered. There were 2 other people with him, a young man and a young woman. Like him, they were dressed in white laboratory coats. He was talking to them as they entered the room and walked toward our cages. 3 groups, 20 for training on injection Series A, 20 on Series B. That will leave 23 for the control group. They get no injections at all, except to keep the test exactly even. We will prick them with a plain needle. Let's call the groups A, B, and C for control. Tag them and number them A1 through A20, B1 through B20, and so on. Number the cages the same way and keep each rat in the same cage throughout. Diet will be the same for all. When do we start the injections? As soon as we're through with the tagging. We'll do that now. George, you number the tags and the cages. Julie, you tie them on. All hold. So, the young woman's name was Julie. The young man was George. They all put gloves on, long, tough plastic ones that came to their elbows. One by one we were taken from our cages, held gently but firmly by Dr. Schultz, while Julie fastened around each of our necks a narrow ribbon of yellow plastic bearing a number. I learned eventually that mine was number A10. They were kind, especially Julie. I remember that when one rat was being tagged, she looked at it and said, "Poor little thing, he's frightened. Look how he's trembling."
What kind of biologist are you? Said Dr. Schultz. The poor little thing is a she, not a he.
When my turn came, the door of my cage slid open just enough for Dr. Schultz to put his gloved hand through. I cowered to the back of the cage, which was just what he expected me to do. One hand pressed me flat against the wire wall, then his fingers gripped my shoulders. The other hand held my head just behind the ears. I was powerless. I was lifted from the cage and felt the plastic collar clipped around my neck. I was back inside the door closed. I was back inside with the door closed in less than a minute. The collar was not tight, but no amount of tugging, twisting, or shaking was I ever able to get it off. I watched through the wire front of my cage as the others were caught and tagged. About 6 cages down from me, on the same shelf, I saw them put a collar on Jenner, but once he was back in his cage, I could see him no longer. A little later in the morning, they came around again, this time pushing a table on wheels. It was loaded with a bottle of some clear liquid, a long rack of sharp needles, and a plunger. Once more I was lifted from the cage. This time George did the holding, while Dr. Schultz fastened one of the needles to the plunger. I felt a sharp pain in my hip. Then it was over. We all got used to that, for from then on, we got injections at least twice a week. What they were injecting and why, I did not know. Yet for 20 of us, those injections were to change our whole lives.